Morning, everyone. Thank you very much for coming out here today to talk about the opportunities to advance human rights reporting. I'm Krista Henery, Executive Director of the Fund for Peace, and I welcome you. I'd like to mention that we are videotaping this, so this is a public, and we will have this videotape posted on websites later, and we'll let you all know where that is available. So the reason for this meeting, the Fund for Peace focuses on understanding the underlying conditions of conflict and building practical tools to alleviate those conditions. Human rights abuses are both a condition of conflict and a symptom of conflict. And so it's very, very important to our work. But we are not a human rights organization per se, but we rely critically on the work of human rights organizations to inform our work on resolving conflict. Governments are responsible for protecting the human rights of their citizens. When they cannot do this or do not do this, we consider them weak, fragile, or failing. In some cases, they actually are the abusers. The work of human rights reporting is so critical to the international community so that others of us can work to change the facts on the ground. But are we doing enough to report on human rights accurately? And are we doing enough to actually change the conditions on the ground and actually put the human rights reporters out of work? So Mark, there was a recent report from the Council on Foreign Relations, and I'm going to ask you to tell us about that and some of your work. So I'll introduce the speakers right before they speak. Mark Lagon is Adjunct Senior Fellow for Human Rights at the Council on Foreign Relations. He also serves as the chair of the International Relations and Security Concentration in the Georgetown University Master of Science in Foreign Service program, teaching multilateral politics and the ethics of international relations. Dr. Lagon was U.S. Ambassador at Large, directing the Office to Monitor and Combat Trafficking in Persons at the U.S. Department of State from 2007 to 2009. Previously, he served in the Bureau of International Organization Affairs at the U.S. Department of State as Deputy Assistant Secretary with lead responsibility for UN reform, human rights, and humanitarian issues and outreach. As a member of the Secretary of State Colin Powell's policy planning staff, focused on the United Nations and democracy and human rights, and on the senior staff of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee with responsibility including the United Nations, human rights, and the State Department Authorization Bill. So, Mark, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you for a full review of my bio, and it's a pleasure to be here and to be joining my colleagues here in a look at human rights reporting and implementation. My side job is actually here at the Council on Foreign Relations as adjunct fellow, and I'm attached to the program on international institutions and global governance. And has a wonderful set of products called Global Governance Monitors, looking at particular issues like nuclear proliferation, climate change, and so on, and sort of assessing how the world's institutions are doing at promoting these particular areas of policy. And so relatively recently, we came out with a Global Governance Monitor on the human rights regime in the world. And let me summarize the findings, but I think this is what took the interest of some of my colleagues here on the panel. So this is kind of a broad brush assessment of the human rights regime, and the report is printed out on the table outside the room. The overall assessment of how we're doing on human rights in the world is that there is heightened attention and discussion in institutions, but relatively uneven regional efforts, and actual implementation and compliance lags way behind the rhetoric, the discussion, and the trappings of the international organizations. A major focus seems to be creating treaties and creating norms. There's so much focus of the UN and governments on signing treaties, ratifying treaties, passing laws, but where the rubber hits the road is how human rights are actually protected and extended. And that means that that kind of norm creation is a bit overemphasized. Rights monitoring is broad and deep. There are a proliferating number of experts, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about that in depth at the end of my remarks, since that's most pertinent here to our discussion. There's increasing peer-based scrutiny of other countries, whether it's in the African Union, NEPAD, among African nations or, in fact, in the UN's Universal Periodic Review. Capacity building, however, the ability of governments to actually implement rule of law, protections of access to justice for people, that's where we have the problem. And I think that more effort, funding, focus, including of the United Nations, needs to be on that capacity building to actually realize human rights, not just talk about them. On the sort of high order atrocities issues, there have been creation of certain institutions like the International Criminal Court, the concept of responsibility to protect, but there's still been very selective action. The stars aligned to do something in Libya, but occasionally not in other places. And in fact, even in the administration in which I served of George Bush, the president was very focused on what was going on in Darfur, but a series of other equities in Sudan on North-South peace talks and equities in military deployments in Iraq and Afghanistan meant that there was only so far in action that there was an effort to address atrocities. On political and civil rights, there's been a backlash in the world on freedom of expression and freedom of association. Particularly the international NGOs are quite focused on the way that their partners on the ground in particular countries have been under an onslaught by governments that are in name democratic, like in Russia, or in countries where the governments are not even in name democratic. Luckily, the business community is beginning to focus more on human rights and move beyond the window dressing version of corporate social responsibility to see their interests being advanced by actual rule of law and rights being developed for people. Heavy emphasis on women's and children's rights, but again, the implementation has lagged far behind the talk, the norms, the reporting. And on other areas of group bias, and I know my colleagues may talk a little bit about this, there's been great selectivity. And so there's discussion about intolerance, xenophobia, but there's been a skewed dialogue, such as in the UN about defamation of religions, and only recently has there been a corrective in the UN Human Rights Council to make sure that in preventing religious intolerance, one doesn't walk all over freedom of expression. And of course, the ongoing Durban conferences on racism have ended up being highly biased against Israel, kind of an ongoing example of the Zionism as racism logic. So, some recommendations that came out of this report in brief. Let's empower regional organizations and NGOs to act, because the UN is not the only show in town, and in fact it is, the great advantage of the UN is that it includes every nation in the world. The disadvantage is that it includes every nation in the world, particularly giving equal legitimacy to governments that do not believe in rule of law at home. So we should work in the human rights architecture to empower civil society and regional organizations to do more. There needs, to the degree that we're working in intergovernmental organizations, the formal public institutions, they need to focus more on technical assistance, actually helping countries change the human rights situation on the ground, and not allow this to stay with a rhetorical game of the international community, whether it's an NGO or the UN saying, you need to do more, and a government saying, we're doing more, and it's only promises. There needs to be work that really forces governments to change the situation for access to justice. We need to further renovate the UN global architecture, because the UN Human Rights Council isn't sufficient. But two last thoughts. We need to, in the West, be a little less uptight about the discussion of economic and social rights. The Bush administration focused on development assistance in Africa, HIV/AIDS with the major PEPFAR program, and human trafficking, which I was for a couple of years responsible for. And that demonstrates that even on the right side of the political spectrum, we can recognize where political and civil rights touch on economic and social rights. And then finally, I think we do need to accept that democracy and human rights are not separate lanes. And one of the most important things one can do is advance human rights through the institutions of democracy. So a final word on reporting, the focus of this panel. There's reporting aplenty by human rights NGOs in the world of varying quality. I'm sure that, my liking the work of Freedom House and Transparency International would not be agreed to by some other, people in the world, perhaps even some other people in the room. Some of the most controversial reports are those produced by the U.S. government. The State Department produces 4 of them. I was responsible for 2 years for one of those 4, the Trafficking in Persons report, arguably the most controversial because it gives a grade to every country. I'd be happy to talk in the Q&A and discussion about whether that report is objective and what concerns it weighs. But an interesting development has been the sustained role of UN rapporteurs and the Universal Periodic Review in the UN Human Rights Council. I was a skeptic about the Universal Periodic Review, that it would take the pressure off governments to pass country-specific condemnatory resolutions. But as my colleague Ted Bacone at Brookings has pointed out in a study for Brookings and now a book, the Universal Periodic Review has empowered indigenous-based NGOs to do more reporting on their governments. And that's sort of the vision of this Council on Foreign Relations report, is finding ways in the international institutions to empower civil society. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Mark. I believe our next speaker, David Keyes, will have a bit to say about empowering civil society to act. David Keyes is the Executive Director of Advancing Human Rights and co-founder of cyberdissidents.org, and I'm hoping you're going to tell us a bit more about that organization, as it really was about capacity building of civil society. He served as coordinator for democracy programs under famed Soviet dissident Natan Sharansky and assisted a UN ambassador. He's a contributor to numerous leading publications and has appeared on numerous television programs and spoke on human rights in the U.S. Congress, Italian Parliament, and other places. He's also the founder of Students Against Dictators. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to you, David.
Thanks so much. Thanks so much for having me. Delighted to be here. I want to tell you briefly about the genesis of my human rights organization and the philosophy behind it, because it gets to the heart of what we're talking about here today. Several years ago, I was working for my greatest of all heroes, Natan Sharansky, who was a Soviet dissident and prisoner for 9 years in the Gulag and went on to become Deputy Prime Minister of Israel. And in 2008 and 2009, we recognized that the internet was the future, and this was the place where dissidents like Sharansky, particularly today in the Middle East, had the most amount of freedom and ability to confront dictatorship. And so we set about to build Cyber Dissidents, a network of online activists, particularly in the autocratic Middle Eastern states, the Arab world, and Iran. 2 years ago, I joined together with Robert Bernstein, who is a longtime member of the Council and the founder of Human Rights Watch. And Bob was also the head of Random House for 25 years and was responsible for publishing many of the dissidents like Sharansky and Sakharov and Havel. I'd like to begin just by quoting Sharansky because it is the thesis behind our organization and so much of what we're speaking about. This is what Sharansky has to say about human rights in the world today. He says, "The hypocrisy and double standards of the international human rights organizations reflect the disappearance of a clear moral criteria that alone can guard human rights, a refusal to see the difference between free and totalitarian societies, between a state at peace and a state at war against terrorist regimes, undermines the universal values on which a claim to human rights is based. A commitment to human rights is above all a commitment to democracy and freedom, to the right to defend them, to equate all cultures, to refuse to distinguish between those that are democratic and those that are not, is the profoundest betrayal of human rights. It is acceptable to hold democracies up to a higher standard as long as you recognize that democracies, by definition, are already maintaining higher standards. In its refusal to distinguish democratic from non-democratic regimes, the human rights movement undercuts its own commitment to democratic freedoms and itself becomes a tool of undemocratic powers. I'd like to give just one example from 3 different spheres to prove Sharansky's point and to understand why a real revolution in the human rights community is necessary. We'll start with the UN maybe because it's the easiest target. The idea that Saudi Arabia, a country which lashes gays, which kills people for sorcery, which prevents women from driving, on and on down the list. The list of crimes of Saudi Arabia is literally too long to name and too gruesome to recount. The idea that Saudi Arabia sits in the Human Rights Council in judgment of democratic states as part of the body that creates the understanding of human rights is a profound betrayal of human rights. The idea that the UN just this week sent its rapporteur on food to Canada when 500,000 Syrians do not have enough food to eat. The idea that they're looking into such robust democratic societies as Canada is a profound betrayal of human rights. It's not enough merely to recognize this as true. Much more needs to be done in order to correct these deficiencies. One of the largest human rights groups in the world today, in the last 10 years, did the same number of reports about the state of Israel, the only liberal democratic state in the Middle East, as it did about Iran, Libya, and Syria combined. 3 of the worst, most brutal totalitarian dictators. This is an extremely real and relevant price in the world today. It is precisely the inability to confront those dictatorships over the last decade that in part has abetted and led to the current crises that we're in. The International Human Rights Organization, FIDH, in the last 10 years did 16 reports, long reports, about the state of Israel, a country that grants women's rights and gay rights and has freedom of speech and an independent judiciary. And during the same time period, it did 1 report about Saudi Arabia, a theocratic, draconian, totalitarian state. It did 0 about Kuwait. It did 2 reports about Libya. It did 4 reports about Syria. And so you collect the Middle East's worst dictatorships, and they don't get to a fraction of the reporting that was done about the sole democratic state. Even the press, to a degree, is guilty of this. When the Islamic Jihad spokesperson Khader Adnan went to prison, his name became famous throughout the entire world, and there were press reports in every major newspaper. And just a week later, no fewer than 8 or 10 Palestinians were imprisoned by the Palestinian Authority for criticizing Mahmoud Abbas on Facebook. And this story was nowhere to be seen. And it's yet again a confirmation of what Sharansky was talking about. What Bob and I have seen in the human rights community is a regression away from the fundamental values and human rights espoused in the Universal Declaration and a shift towards reporting about war. I personally think that this is a bad trend because human rights organizations are uniquely incapable of understanding the complexities of asymmetric war and getting it right on that very difficult issue. But first, I'd like to address some of the misconceptions about why there's this disparity between reporting in open and closed societies and dictatorships and democracies. The first is the idea of credibility, that somehow the United States of America loses its credibility when it spends more time, vastly more time, on countries like Saudi Arabia and North Korea and Syria. This is something that I fundamentally reject. The United States, while it has many, many problems, the robust civil society here that is addressing those problems does not need the attention of international institutions, which should be focusing their precious time and resources on countries that whip women for leaving the home without a male relative. We do not lose credibility by focusing on those countries. The idea of being even-handed, that when there are violations in a dictatorship, you must take 2 violations in the dictatorship and 2 in the democracy to remain even-handed. This is a fundamental fallacy. Part of the problem of focusing on war is, as I mentioned, the complexities, particularly in today's asymmetric wars, reporting in Afghanistan and Iraq, reporting in Gaza. When you have groups like Hamas that hide in the Shifa hospital and are surrounded by civilians, and human rights organizations from thousands of miles away attempt to understand which shell was shot properly, what size shell should be shot, with very little understanding of the complexities on the ground and the intelligence behind those decisions and the inherent difficulties of an asymmetric war. There is the idea that neutrality in war is the most important value of a human rights organization. We don't pick a side in a war, no matter who's fighting. We try and make sure that there are as few civilian deaths as possible. Well, this is a strange thought when you think about wars of great consequence like World War II. Is it truly the proper place of a human rights organization to remain neutral between Axis and allies? Can a human rights organization truly remain neutral between North and South during the Civil War? No doubt there were profound human rights violations committed by the North, but who here today would like to say that they have trouble picking a side between those two in the Civil War? And so the reasons for focusing on open societies are many, and they're seductive. Just the other day, a member of a human rights organization in New York said to me, "Yes, David, I understand your thesis, but how do you really expect us to get information out of Saudi Arabia today? You know how difficult it is there." Well, in today's modern age, that's becoming less and less true, and part of the idea behind cyber dissidence was to utilize the immense and overwhelming power of the internet to get these stories out. And one of my suggestions for later is to really focus on online freedom, because the amount of information coming out today is simply more than we can handle. The idea that there's low-hanging fruit in the human rights world, the fact that you can go to democratic societies and sit in nice cafes and make phone calls and everything is safe, and that's why you spend so much time there, is not sufficient. The focus on countries, even where it's difficult to get information, needs to remain the priority of major human rights organizations, even though it's more difficult. But I'd like to speak for a second about social media and the internet today and the role that it can play in human rights reporting, because that's what cyber dissonance is. There was a study that came out about the amount of samizdat underground literature from the Soviet Union from 1950 to 1975. And what this report said, I think by Georgetown or Hopkins, I think it was, 1,500 pieces of underground literature made it to the United States during those 25 years. When we think about the policies that could have been crafted, that should have been understood as a result of hearing the stories of Bukovsky and Sakharov and Amalrik and Marchenko and these many dissidents, and we look today at the Arab world and those autocratic societies that now send out samizdat, underground literature, in the form of tweets and Facebook posts by the tens of thousands a second, there is no longer an excuse to say we don't know what's happening there. We don't have access to the people. There's also been, as was mentioned previous, perhaps an overemphasis on reporting at the expense of implementation. I'd just like to raise one academic study, which I find very interesting, by Paul Slovic out of the University of Oregon. Paul Slovic understands the importance of emphasizing the individual over the amount of information we have. And so Paul Slovic took 3 groups of people, and he gave them each the same amount of money in a test study. And to the first group, he handed facts about the millions of people starving in Africa, and he asked them how much money they were willing to give to this cause. And the second group, he handed them a picture of a single 7-year-old child starving in Africa, and he asked how much they were willing to give to this cause. And the third group, he handed them a picture of a 7-year-old girl and a 7-year-old boy, and asked how much they were willing to give to this cause. And on average, people gave twice as much money when confronted with the single face, as opposed to the facts about the millions of people starving. And so when we think about the mass abuses that are occurring in Saudi Arabia and Syria and Gaza and Egypt and North Korea and so many other dictatorships around the world, I think the emphasis of human rights reporting today needs to remain squarely focused on the individual. This is part of what the Soviet Jewry movement did so well. It made the Soviet Jewry movement about Soviet Jews. And even without the power of social media, rallies were organized with 250,000 people on the Washington Mall. And I spoke not long ago at Google to a group of Arab cyber dissidents, and I said, even with all the power that you have to tell your story, you haven't succeeded in mobilizing the sort of public pressure that Soviet dissidents mobilized in their day with a fraction of the power that you have. So my modest suggestions for this panel, and I'd like to open it up for discussion later or questions, is that we return to the basics of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, freedom of speech and women's rights in particular, that the idea that human rights organizations are judges in war and can understand the complexities is fundamentally false, and that if we raise up dictatorships to the level of democracies, if we open these societies, it will be better off for those societies, better off for peace, better off for stability, and better off for prosperity for us all. Thank you so much.
Great, thank you, David.
Thanks, David.
And now I'll be turning it over to our last speaker, Jean Abenader, who is with the Moroccan American Center. This center promotes closer economic, political, and security relations between Morocco and the United States. Jean is really an expert in Arab American advocacy, U.S. Middle East affairs. He's worked on trade, investment programs, education, training projects, advocacy, tourism promotion, and similar issues throughout the region. And he's going to talk about a case study of the countries of Algeria, Libya, Morocco, Mauritania, and Tunisia. So, Jean?
Thanks, Krista. Like Krista, I come to this from a different background than my colleagues, and I really appreciate the points that they made, but I want to look at it from a different way. I'm a communications person, strategic communications, but I'm also a process person. In my office where I work, we have people with far more experience on human rights. Bob Hawley, for example, has worked in some of the great garden spots of the world like Haiti and knows firsthand. Jordan Paul is not knee-deep, but hip-deep and chest-deep in Cuba, for example. Caitlin Deering has worked a lot when she was Caitlin Deering on Democratic Republic of Congo. So they're kind of the subject matter experts on human rights abuses. I'm more concerned in looking at Morocco and North Africa as to how reporting reflects to the highest degree of accuracy possible what is actually going on the ground and what we can do about it. For two reasons. One is so that we don't kid ourselves that somehow Western perspectives are the only perspectives. And secondly, that the process itself incorporates, as Mark said, as much as possible local capacity to report on human rights, because I think that that's really the critical part of it. And I think there's, listening to David's remarks, there's a whole bunch of countries out there that are between dictatorships and autocrats and democracies. And that's where most of the world is. And I'm concerned about the process with those countries, despite, I agree with you, the abuses that are visited on Canada and the US and others, and the autocrats, which we can't have access to. But I'm worried about all those countries in the middle who the standards seem to be imposed either from the Western side or they're thrown in the barrel of the autocratic dictatorship side. So what was the genesis for our studies? We were looking at how human rights is reported in North Africa for a couple reasons. One, we wanted to see if human rights organizations actually could do analyses that allowed not just for profiles of one country, but could you look at things across the region? My assumption is, as a person who's done a lot of research, is that you can take regions like Southeast Asia, like the Andean countries, like Central America, and you can profit by looking not just at conditions in that country, but across the region, and you may learn things that you don't understand otherwise. For example, on women's rights, on the concepts of free speech, on the ideas of assembly. And this came to me from a conversation I had in Rabat. I was sitting with a colleague of mine who's a communications person there. He said, it's always been interesting to me that you Americans have this trilogy of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Have you ever thought about those in the context of human rights? And that kind of kicked this whole study off 2 years ago. And so in my simple marketing mind, for me, life are the individual rights, liberty are the associative rights, in other words, without interacting with other people, and pursuit of happiness are the economic, cultural, and social rights. And so I began to do research on that, and fortunately we have a very good staff. And so we said, okay, what has the reporting that has been done for the last 5 years, it's now 6 years because it's a 2-year study, what has the reporting taught us about life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness in terms of North Africa? Can we learn something from looking at Mauritania, Morocco, Algeria, Libya, and Tunisia as a group? We looked at who do the best reporting in the world and the most comprehensive that allow you for comparative analysis. And that would be Freedom House, Amnesty, Human Rights Watch, and the State Department. They're the only ones, except for the omission of Mauritania in some cases, the only ones that have been in all countries, in all 5 countries in the time period we're looking at. And so we were saying, okay, how can we, in analyzing these, improve the content of the reports by having a better process? And as Mark mentioned, the Arab Spring, and as David and I were talking, has exploded the interest in all of this. Because when we started this project, Arab Spring hadn't happened yet. And then we finished the first draft and you had Arab Spring. And so all of a sudden, Tunisia, Libya is in play. Thank God we weren't working on Egypt. Put it over here. But Algeria may still be in play. Morocco moved very quickly to have a constitutional referendum and then elect a new government, so they are steps ahead, at least in terms of process, than the other countries. But what it does is it says to us, as we look forward, there are some qualms out there among policymakers and among commentators, and that is, okay, all of these are going to end up being Islamic-led governments. Well, what does that mean? Well, the first notion is that all Muslims are the same. And I think if anybody knows anything about the region, they're not. So the first thing we have to challenge is our stereotype of how are Muslims going to approach concepts of human rights. And how do they define human rights? Every survey that I've seen that's been taken in the Middle East in the last 7 years, Pew, Gallup, Zogby, Arabs primarily define democracy in terms of economic rights, not in terms of political rights. They have to figure out how to expand the pie, how to have access to resources, how to have access to opportunities. And if you look at the Arab Spring, whether you're looking at Tunisia, Libya, Morocco, Algeria, where they've had some demonstrations and some activity, they don't make a distinction between political rights and economic rights. And so I think when we want to look at human rights to be more precise, we have to start looking at what we like to call context. Human rights occurring in context. And what are the contexts in those countries? Well, I think the first thing we have to examine is, and this I think is worth discussion at some point, is the absolute one universality of human rights, and number two, the tie between human rights and democracy. I'm not so sure that they consistently go hand in hand, human rights and democracy. Yes, democracy is the ultimate guarantor of human rights, but I'm not sure in terms of facilitating more human rights and the protection of human rights that democracy as a Western form of government is necessarily the best step forward, particularly in countries where there are so many minorities, subgroups in terms of religions, issues among women's rights, and enormous problems with things like child health, maternal care, basic job opportunities, access to education. So I think that, looking at, for example, what Krista does in the Failed States report, those indicators like that are used by the MCC in terms of performance of countries in certain areas of opportunities, maybe those may give us more insights into how we should be doing human rights reporting. In other words, broaden the basis of human rights reporting, not just the universality of human rights, which, remember, is a Western model coming out of France and England in the 18th century, but also looking at context and what context is important. Well, if you look at the work that Fund for Peace does, they have 132 variables, if I'm not mistaken, last time I checked, right? That's a lot of work. Nobody has the ability to do that on a regular basis for a world report. But is it possible that there's more integration and more sharing of information among human rights reporting groups that might make that kind of information accessible and therefore more useful in terms of the outcome? So you have the Moroccan government, which has passed the constitution. They now have an Islamic-led government. They've passed their initial budget, and they're going forward. Well, does that mean we no longer pay attention to them because, we give them a year grace period? Or do we kind of take the experiences and lessons from Morocco and inform, therefore, what's going on in Tunisia, inform what's going on in Libya, or is Libya and Tunisia so different? So I think we have to understand where the value add is from doing a comparative analysis and where the value add comes from in terms of looking for lessons learned from experiences in different parts of the world. So, remind you that there's a number of handouts outside that I think you would like to pick up. So we did this report on 5 countries over 6 years. The full report will be out this summer. And 2 points that we make in the report. One is that the Arab uprisings have had a two-edged sword effect on human rights. On the one hand, people are demanding equality and human rights, but on the other hand, they're demanding justice and recalibrating of privilege. And for a person interested in conflict resolution, the second one may not always coexist with the first. So it's a time of transition for citizens and governments and actors in these countries and civil societies, and their receptivity to our notions of human rights are muddled at best. So at the same time, though, human rights cannot be a sidebar conversation with these governments. When I look at what's going on in terms of where the U.S. government's spending its money on the Arab uprising, because it's primarily on economic development, economic growth, which is right, because jobs can't exist in countries where you have to pay bakshish to get a job, or you have to pay bakshish to have your kids go to school, or so much still depends on who you know. So I think even the good work that we're trying to do in countries has to be informed by this conversation. So finally, I think that if human rights is going to have a very positive and beneficial impact, we have to do a couple things. One is not extrapolate, as the tendency is to do in the reporting that we follow. They find 3 or 4 cases, whether it's oppression of women in certain cases or denial of certain privileges or access or whatever. They extrapolate from these limited cases to a national critique. I don't think that's helpful. I don't think human rights reporting is helpful when it minimizes the importance of local conditions and capacities and capabilities to support human rights protections. I strongly agree with Mark and the CFR report that capacity building at a local level is the best opportunity for moving forward in addressing human rights progress. I think that human rights reports that recommend actions inconsistent with the country's multiple identities or lack support with the local population is not helpful, and we have to think more about that. Again, if we're better informed by local sources, we might have better opportunities. We have to recognize, as David pointed out as well, there are competing priorities between economic, social, and cultural rights and what we call political, human, civil rights. Finally, I think it's really, really important that we emphasize with our partners in the multilateral community and the international community more capability to work together, to integrate our opportunities, to build capacity. And I want to thank Mark, the CFR, for the work that you did, for being able to provide a basis for this conversation. And I think it is the beginning of a conversation. And I hope the human rights community really does not only take up the recommendations that you have put in the report, but also thinks much more deeply and rigorously about the need for context and the need to not extrapolate without really firmly understanding what's going on in the local countries by having the broadest and most capable base possible in the countries that they're looking at. Good.
Great, thank you very much. I must say, all of the speakers have brought up issues that are near and dear to my heart. You mentioned the Failed States Index, which is something that we do put together at the Fund for Peace once a year on 177 countries. And when we started that, finding the data to be able to do a broad social, economic, environment, political, military, to finding the data to be able to understand all of those issues, the context, all the different human rights issues. We're really big on political, legal, but very much economic and social and cultural rights. Finding the data was incredibly difficult, and we had to get really innovative and actually create data of our own. But nowadays, there's satellite imagery. We also have, of course, the social media that was mentioned. You have cell phones are a great way to get data, and we work on building local civil society capacity because we believe our Failed States Index, this is a high-level look at the world. It's just telling you kind of where you need to look some more. But you can't actually make policy on something like the Failed States Index. You have to make it, as all of the speakers, I believe, have said, on local knowledge, on really understanding what's going on the ground. And the local capacity is so important. Because the problems in the world, the issues and the challenges, are not going to be solved by us. They're going to be solved by us, the international community. They're going to be solved by the international community helping to give the local people the ability to hold their governments accountable and give the governments the ability to have the capacity to do some of the things. Because sometimes it's not a lack of will, it's just a lack of capacity. So I don't know where to go next with this, because I could go deep into the data issue, deep into local capacity building, the need for context. It's all incredibly important. But maybe I will bring up something. I believe we had one issue to potentially debate, which was the idea of human rights and democracy going hand in hand or not. That's something that I've often thought about, because the idea that we have Western views and Western bias, which is also something incredibly important. And what are the best ways, or what are the different ways that different places can have, assure human rights? And so, Mark, I believe you were very much in the view that democracy and human rights go hand in hand. And Jean, you had a slightly different view. And David, I will pull you into this too, but I'll start with Mark.
Well,
You're in the middle.
I think you may be closer to one side, but democracy and human rights are not one and the same. There's a chicken and egg question. Whether you build up human rights in a society, protections of minority rights, freedom of expression, and so on, and you get to democracy. I think there's a mistake to think that the causal arrow goes that way only. In fact, there are protections in a democracy. It's really important not to think democracy is only elections, though. Democracy is a set of institutional arrangements that include some protections in law of liberties. They're not one and the same, but I think that it's the best institutional arrangement. And sure, it is an institutional arrangement that it's found itself in certain regions of the world, and so it leads to what I think is an unfair accusation that it's regionally and culturally bound. But I think it comes down to, not only is democracy a protection of human rights, but it allows for a certain nimbleness and flexibility, so that the government of a society can incorporate the will of pluralistic groups. The problem with too many governments, frankly, in the Middle East and North Africa region, is that they're brittle. And that arguably democracy, for whatever its faults, whatever dangers there might be of Islamists who might seize power in an election, it's not brittle in the long run.
Yeah. No, well, I'm of the chicken and egg persuasion, Mark. I agree. My concern is that, for example, under George Bush, I don't know, 43, I guess at your age, it was probably Bush 43 that you worked under. There was way too much emphasis on elections. I can't tell you how often I sat with Liz Cheney in meetings with MEPI and with other folks, and there was this drive, and I kept saying they're going to elect people you don't like. At least one thing I do know is I know the Middle East.
Like Hamas.
Yeah, and so, and yet we have, and then on the other end you have our friends in Venezuela, you have our friends in Ecuador, you have our friends in other countries, Nicaragua, where, oh my goodness, here's the flourishing of democracy, and who do they elect? Populists who don't serve the better interests of the region. And so that's why my argument is, if you look at it as a region, and I'm just talking about North Africa because that's what our study focused on. If you look at it as a region, I think there are things that we can learn from all of those countries. For example, everybody's very excited about Tunisia, okay? Why? Because, well, they're secular Muslims. Well, has anybody asked them what a secular Muslim is? Or what Islamic democracy is, which is another thing you hear banding about? Or is it, in terms of the culture, look at Morocco, think Thailand in the 70s, where the king, as the ultimate guarantor of stability and security and religious dialogue, is able to, in some ways, instill more democratic behaviors than the parliament. So I'm not sure that it's a slam dunk. I agree with you on the causality. I think we have to look at how each culture and society, and as you know, they're multicultural societies, even in Tunisia, how they can define their aspirations and how we can enable those aspirations. I see democracy as an enabler, not as an end in itself.
I just have a short comment to add. I'm firmly of the persuasion that there are certain unalienable rights that are endowed by one's creator, that no matter the time nor the place, they can't be taken away, certainly not by the whims of any government. And included on that list is freedom of speech, expression, religion, etc. This isn't going to look exactly alike in every place, but a poll was taken recently in Egypt in which 84% of Egyptians, according to Pew, said that whoever changes their religion should be killed for it. That was the proper punishment. That's because it says in the hadith, "Man ghayar dinu faqtaluhu." Whoever changes his religion, kill him. Now, whether or not most Egyptians believe that, whether the poll is flawed or right, no one should be killed for changing their religion ever, for changing their mind about a religion. And so the real question here is, how do we help strengthen Egyptian liberalism? And that's an almost impossible question to ask. I have Egyptian friends who run a liberal organization, and they feel entirely abandoned by the West, by the United States government, by human rights organizations even. And they feel that the reason why that wing of Islamism is succeeding is because liberal ideas have never really been allowed to take root. And they're not even quite sure why that's so. How do you get to a position where 84% of a populace, if this poll is right, it's Christopher Hitchens once told me, never listen to any poll on anything ever. So I'm violating that rule. But that's a dangerous proposition. But I think that we need not conflate between the fundamental rights of man, to change your mind about religion, to speak your mind and not go to prison. Those fundamental values need to come to every country on earth. And whether that looks exactly like America, surely not. But there should be, I think, no discussion that slavery in every country is always wrong, no matter what the majority of people say. And that was the position of Abraham Lincoln and some of the founders, at least. And that's something that we should aspire to throughout the world.
We have a great group of participants here, so I'll throw it out now. If you all would like to talk on this issue or bring up a new issue or ask questions, I believe I saw a microphone, and the gentleman right there. Thank you.
Good morning. Thanks, first of all, for doing this. It's very useful. My name is Bob Holly. I'm a retired Foreign Service officer. I am associated with the Moroccan American Center, and I've done a lot of work on governance and human rights issues in different places in the world and at the department. If you'll permit me, I'd like to make just a passing comment on that last question that went, but I really want to ask a question of David. I've never been really fond of the notion of democracy promotion because I think the term covers too many misconceptions. I like to think of it as it's a process, right? Building democratic governments is a process. And we have a tendency, I think, in the community associated with human rights to set a standard up here and then forget that getting from A to B is that process, and you need to make critical judgments about how people are doing in their progress along that process as we comment on them, preferably in ways that help them get there. I mean, I've lived in societies where you have the elements of consent in governance, some freedom of speech, some rule of law, some freedom of association, some freedom of expression, some access to justice, that you see somewhere on that continuum, and sometimes even elections at some level, and some institutions of consent or processes of consent where you wouldn't call the government democratic, but you see they are a society in transition politically. And then you need to make judgments about where they are in that process and where the direction's going and how you can best help them. But the question I wanted to, so I really don't see necessarily some dichotomy between democracy and human rights. Question I wanted to ask David was this issue about information. You know, and I take your point. You know, there's a lot more information available because of the net today than there was in the past. But information is also another one of those words that is kind of slippery, you know, when you think about it. Governments are not the only ones that are adept at the promotion of misinformation and disinformation. Local political actors with agendas are also quite sophisticated in using the net to promote a particular political agenda and putting out a lot of either misinformation or disinformation. And that's something I think that the community, whether it's the human rights community who's reporting or the press, which is fond of picking up statements that have high news value associated with them, although they may not represent anything really in the situation on the ground, doesn't do a very good job of establishing some kind of standard, you know, by which you judge the information. I like this notion that there's a lot more information out there, and I agree with it. But what do, you know, to sort out disinformation, bad information, information associated with agendas? How do you build in safeguards?
Well, you just highlighted the most difficult part of my job personally. The internet has famously changed the way we think. It's changed a lot. Nicholas Carr wrote a few interesting books about this, and it's changed even the way we read. We no longer read word after word. We skim everything and we scan. And the distilling information is so difficult, particularly when you're looking for something. I mean, my group focuses on pro-democracy dissidents. And the idea that I have to, or my staff has to look through the blog posts of hundreds and sometimes thousands potentially of people, potentially even greater. I mean, there's tens of thousands of bloggers in just about every Arab country today, and trying to understand who these people are, what they want, whether they really believe in democracy, whether they even really exist. I mean, we had the famous case of this lesbian Syrian blogger who was outed as some guy sitting in Nebraska. I forget where he was from, but everyone was following him and quoting him and retweeting. It's almost impossible, and sometimes I just you have to throw up your hands and recognize how limited your ability to understand what's going on is. I mean, at best, I have a fraction of a snapshot, and I think part of the problem that led to the misestimations or the lack of understanding by government institutions for Middle Eastern countries was exactly that problem. They were listening to all the wrong people. They'd meet with diplomats, and they'd meet with heads of think tanks, and they'd meet with people in the institutions who would see reality very differently than the way many of these online activists did. And I remember thinking when I lived in Egypt, that, you know, I was living in the Islamist slum of Imbaba, one of the poorest places in Egypt, and I came away thinking, my God, this is one of the most unstable places I can imagine. And then I heard, you know, and I couldn't believe 2 weeks before Hosni Mubarak fell that when Secretary Clinton was asked what the assessment of Egypt was, she said, our assessment is that the Egyptian government is stable. And I thought back to all those British and American diplomats who called Iran an island of stability, you know, weeks before the Shah fell and everything. I mean, it seemed like it was recreating itself. And so where the stream of information that you get and listen to is just completely changes your worldview. I don't have a comprehensive answer about how we filter through. We do our best. We make mistakes. We try and get to know the people themselves. A lot of it's word of mouth, and you build networks that hopefully slowly become bigger and bigger. But you're also right that regimes have become incredibly adept, especially in Iran, with entire cyber armies at putting out disinformation, misinformation. The sophistication is really scary and eerie. My only hope is that the power of the people is ultimately better than even regimes who are brutal and adept at using the internet. I know that didn't really answer your question, but I tried.
It's more of a question. I don't know.
Yeah. I mean,
Well, one of the things that we found is the importance of triangulating data, that you can't rely on any one data source. You know, statistics lie, polls can be written in such a way that they're swayed, you can have misinformation in the blogs, you can have, you know, but if you look at it all and you triangulate and you compare it and you say, okay, all of my data sources are telling me the same story, this is probably the truth, or the data sources aren't telling you the right thing, and then you look at how do I build local capacity first, voices there to figure out who are the real voices first off, and then how do we get the information from them more regularly. That means a lot of work. So lots and lots of analysts that I think spend most of their time. One of my friends that calls them data sherpers. You know, people decide they want to be an analyst in the US government, and instead they spend 95% of their time trying to get data and only have 5% of their time left to analyze it. Flavia? Oh, the microphone's coming. Just 2 seconds.
Oh, yes. Thank you. Thank you for this. I feel so relieved to hear people with this intelligence talking about that openly. Thank you for that. I've been working in Mali, in Guinea, in Rwanda, and in Liberia, in Bolivia, personally. And my experience with civil society organizations is they have their own agenda, so we also need to be very careful with whom we are talking with. Sometimes there is, from my point of view, I come in from Latin America, so I have this sensitivity. There is a sort of racism before our good intentions to go to the field, and we feel that people are very nice because they're poor, or they're Latins, or they're black, or something that for us is someone that we need to help. So this intelligence from our point of view to find people that they're really, really represented local communities. I have a very good experience and very bad. In Liberia, I have a terrible experience working with people that they're trying to report on facts. They don't understand the differences in an opinion and a fact, but it's not their problem. It's also our problem. In our communities, again, my origins are very important for me to understand. Your culture, my culture is different. Facts is something that also comes from the opinion arena. You have an idea of how I should think, how I should express myself. And it was very interesting. I went to the African Commission for Human Rights, and I was there many days, and I hear many reports from civil society organizations and from governments, and they were terrible. Everybody were talking about opinions, how they do the very good job. So I think we as a human rights people, we need, or people who cares about human rights, we need to be very careful on that. And I think I do a less sexy work because I don't have this first impact in the international community, because I'm going there to the rural communities. And when I'm going there, nobody's listening. They don't care about access to information or participation. They are concepts. And sometimes we don't even understand these concepts have any sense if it's not a practical something. And I had this experience in Congo 1 month ago, and I was there and I was asking for our local partners, and they said, what right to participation is? Right to participation, what is that? That means that if the government put the budget for public information, you need to go and ask that and start moving this. So I'm super happy that you want to support civil society organizations, but not just to put in the line with done. It's just to look at for the ones that they represent communities. I personally think that each time, and it's Mohamed Yunus, I think the Grameen Bank said something that is very important, go to the field where the people is suffering, but not to take pictures of people because they're happy as well, they have many things to give us, but to be sure that we are gathering information from the real ones and understand and filter what they say. Sometimes communities they're anger, they said, we are against companies, we are against the government, but what do you want? And I think this is very important. The people I'm working with, they have not access to internet. Some of them know mobile phones, but there are, I think there's 1.2 billion people affected for this kind of extractive is what I do in natural resources. So just thank you for that, and I want to point it out this from the other side.
Your good comment prompts some broad thoughts that I'd love to impart before we're done today. One, it is important to remember that NGOs have their own agenda, but everybody has their own agenda. Every government has their own agenda. Every government in Middle East and North Africa that makes promises about its change has its own agenda. The United States, at the same time as it's promoting democracy, and I agree it should facilitate democracy, but it has its own agenda. Lenses that you have on your nose for seeing the world are true for everybody. Having spent 3 or 4 years of my life focused heavily on human trafficking, I found in the Gulf, but all over the world, law enforcement would look at some people and see a migrant worker or see a woman in prostitution, and they would think they knew what they were getting into, their fault. And very often, it turns out they are a human trafficking victim, and it depends what lenses you have on your nose. There is a danger to have the lenses on your nose in the United States and say, we need to be patient, and another culture may not want democracy. Whatever criticisms you might have for President George W. Bush, he had an expression about the soft bigotry of low expectations, and he first suggested this about Hispanics where he was governor, but there's, assuming that there aren't big hopes or possibilities for political development in North Africa might represent a kind of soft bigotry of low expectations. And so my last point, we are on the same side that we need to build local capacity. But let us not let that focus on capacity take people off the hook on the question of will. Because there may be lacking capacity to implement human rights, but that doesn't mean there isn't also lacking will. They may both be problems.
Well, I see those, both your remarks are related. The last thing I want to see is relativity, that everything is relative. But I want to see things as relevant, okay? And what do I mean by that? I mean that going to Ecuador or going to Liberia and the different groups there, going to Morocco, going to Libya, and saying, okay, what is democracy? See, that's where I see the gap. What is democracy? George Bush may have had the the bigotry of high expectations, in the sense that a lot of people want to be fed or to be able to feed themselves. They want their children to go to school. And how they get that is very much a definition of what their expectations are. And those will have, as you said, implications politically, the will issues. But I think we are still overreaching when we think that somehow we can create formulas that can be used across the board in terms of how the relationship between civil society and governments, between whole. I've been arguing for years that what people like me, who are analysts on the region, should be writing is about the new social contracts. Because what that essentially says is, what are the mutual perceptions that people have of their governments, of each other? And as David pointed out, there are a lot of society issues in all of these countries that go right against the face of democracy. So that's what I'm saying, is I think rather than use democracy as a catch-all, maybe there is no catch-all. Maybe instead what we do is we create profiles of what the aspirations are, of what the identities are of these people. And I think there's too little interest being paid to how people identify themselves. And that's where I think that more work needs to be done. I think capacity building is part of it. I think having an open discussion on civil society and the communications among people and organizations, all of these are part of it. I'm not saying there aren't universal values, but I'm saying how people will accept them is a contextual issue.
Yeah, I actually just want to pick up on this. This is an important point, and I will stand by trying to encourage human rights and democracy, but in my writing in a book that I'm co-editing, I really think that we need to focus on a dialogue about what really is universally accepted, and perhaps we need to step away from some of the language that is seen as made in the West, and perhaps talk about human dignity and what there is a universal acceptance on. I think there's actually a possibility, by looking at that concept that kind of in a way predates human rights, where we could actually find some common ground. When you look at economic and social rights, you look at, feeding people or making sure that they have health services. We need to also look at, those things are not going to do any good unless they have access to justice in a political and civil way as well.
You mentioned human dignity. One thing we found very important is human welfare. There's been reports recently that, the human rights abuses, when they go and study who's actually committing human rights abuses, and then they look at their lives, they are actually the victims of human rights abuses themselves and the systems that they're in. And so if the public security forces don't have their own human welfare, dignity, and respect, then they're more likely to be committing human rights abuses on than the general population. And I think sometimes we think about, the human rights abusers from a very legal issue. How do we put them in court? And I mean, the kind of the public security, not the dictators. It's a different story. But with the more general people, how do we actually work on their welfare? Because if we work on their welfare, their respect, and as you say, dignity, then we'll probably go a lot farther in ensuring human rights protection.
I was just at the Newsweek Women in the World, and they had a whole panel about honor killings and forced marriages, and several of the panelists who had gone through forced marriages said that it was their mothers and it was the women who were most strident, who were most willing to resort to violence, who were most coercive. And it's just one of these things, it's like groups of Saudi women who are, by far the most, Saudi women started a Facebook group called I Trust My Guardian, saying we should never be allowed to drive, my guardian should decide, and that's how it should stay. And it just adds a whole nother level of complexity. But I'd also just like to add one short comment about much of the work we do is not actually focused on building civil society, despite its profound importance. But I think of all the examples where decisions can be made by the people currently in power that are not being pressured nearly enough. And I think about the Saudi education system that today prints millions of textbooks to 6 million Saudi school children, calling Jews and Christians apes and pigs. And I think to myself, that's a decision which could be ended with 1 second, with the wave of a hand, with the signature. It doesn't require anything but more pressure, and I don't even see that being. I mean, I feel like that's a first step. Here we are sending $60 billion worth of arms to Saudi Arabia with no conditionality, with no real pressure on human rights, having spoken to countless Saudi dissidents and countless U.S. diplomats about this issue. That's something that doesn't require going there and talking. It doesn't require building civil society. It requires sustained pressure to stop an outrageous and abominable form of describing another human being.
In an ally
Yeah.
of the United States.
Well, I think this, Mark, I really like the focus on justice. And yet, the same thing happens when we go into the countries and we ask them, what does justice mean? And it's always my justice they always see it as a zero-sum game. But this is where I think the developmental part has to really come in terms of a very complex, multi-level kind of approach. But, your point's well taken, David. I think that U.S. foreign policy is fraught with these issues of competing priorities. Security and all these countries are as well. I mean, you look at Mali, for example, look at Niger. I'm not even going to talk about North Africa. You just go to the south and Nigeria and Boko Haram. I mean, how do you help these people, on the one hand, achieve whatever values we want them to move toward in terms of politics and civil society and equality, and at the same time, they're trying to just keep their countries together? I mean, you go look at northern Mali. I mean, the Islamic extremists went in and destroyed an Islamic shrine. I mean, the world is fraught with so many difficulties. It gets back to the point of where do we begin? And I think one point is to have governments that we can talk to become more responsible for their behavior, at the same time not losing sight of other priorities that we have, whether it's against Iran, which is drives our relationship with Saudi Arabia this time, whether it's turning a blind eye to what some of our friends in Latin America are doing. I mean, it's all over the place that American foreign policy has to be realistic. But the down payment today is going to cost us more tomorrow. I think that's the real issue.
Yeah. I'll just make one quick retort. When I compare between the 80s and today, You know what, let's take 1975 and Scoop Jackson, and the Jackson-Vanik Amendment tying most favored nation status to the right of free immigration. The idea that Scoop Jackson was willing to stand up to an evil empire which killed tens of millions of people, which had tens of thousands of nuclear warheads aimed right here, that spanned 11 time zones, and he was willing to confront and challenge our very relationship with the Soviet Union based on the rights of a bunch of people to leave whenever they wanted. That's the sort of civilizational and cultural and national confidence that I'd like to see restored, particularly in the Middle East. There's no doubt that there's important security elements. I served in the military myself. I'm aware of some of these very difficult intelligence relationships that we need to maintain, but at the same time, I feel like the pendulum has swung very far away from that. We so easily comport to the desires of some of the most brutal autocracies, certainly in the Middle East. Hosni Mubarak getting $50 billion worth of aid and assistance when he was throwing students like Karim Amr in prison for 4 years for criticizing him is outrageous. And I'd like to see us go back to that time where the names of dissidents were brought up in most bilateral meetings, and the idea that the United States and the West was willing to confront dictatorships on issues such as free immigrations. A Saudi woman cannot leave today without permission of a male guardian. Why is it that Scoop Jackson could confront a nuclear nation which threatened our very annihilation? And that's an issue which is barely brought up in today's discourse. Well, yeah, sure.
But did it make Russia more of a democracy, though? I mean, that's the problem. I don't see how, aside from getting immigration for Soviet Jewry, that it did anything for Russia or our relationships with the Soviet Union. So I don't hold up the elections they just had in Russia as any example for any other country to have.
Yeah.
So that,
Michael, please.
Thank you. Michael Fine. So let me ask you two questions, and I ask both of them with an understanding that the answers are complex. They're very sensitive areas, but I want to at least put these issues on the table. The first is the extent to which public education is part of capacity building. It's not just working with governments on their ability to deal with human rights issues, and the NGO community, but getting a general public to have a better comprehension of the connection between rights and outcomes. Access to information is an example of that. Do people understand that means that roads will be built in the right place for a better price, and therefore there's a better economic opportunity for everyone? My sense is there's not enough of that around the world, often here as well at home. The second question relates to the role and perhaps responsibility of the private sector. None of you have talked about that. And I'm thinking in particular multinational companies. There was a reference earlier to Transparency International and its role, and my background is in the anti-corruption area, and I know a bit about TI's work. One of the most effective practices they've had is the ranking of countries by perceived corruption. And one can argue about the quality of those rankings, certainly, but there's no element of what TI does that has had a greater impact on, I think, on the corruption picture through the use of those figures in risk analysis by companies when they decide whether or not to make an investment. Understanding that this is a complex area and that not every country and environment is the same, is there a role for that kind of judgment by foreign investors as a lever for progress?
Well, why don't you take briefly the second one? My colleagues might want to take the first one. I'm quite in favor of public education and transparency about facts as a way of economically prospering in a society as well as building political rights. But as far as multinational corporations, I touched on it very briefly about the conclusions of the Council on Foreign Relations report. But indeed, corporations are taking on a more substantial role, which has moved beyond corporate social responsibility. Just as an editorial point here, I think there is a problem of companies being so focused on being rated on being green, which is good, that they are concerned about sustainability questions, but they ought to be also looked at in terms of the way they're actually promoting human rights. All too often, companies say, well, we need to be engaged in this closed or semi-closed society because we'll help the populations, and they often don't. I do think you put your finger right on the right thing. If you try and do assessments of rule of law, which is sort of the nice euphemism for the flip side of corruption. That is something where you can mobilize the market in the sense that if companies see a place is not worthy of trust, it's not a place you want to put your money, that can become a driver for even the elites, even the political elites of some countries trying to change things. So I think that's a classic win-win if you focus on corruption and trying to assess that and making that widely known in a transparent way.
You want to say anything? I work with Civitas and street law on these kinds of issues and public education issues. And it's not, what's interesting is it's not from lack of materials or not from lack of expertise. It's lack of funding as usual. They have great programs in countries all over the world, but if you want to look up street law and you want to look up Civitas, those are two that do a lot, and they specifically look at education from middle school up. With regard to Transparency International, it is a very important tool, exactly for what Mark said, because it also makes the business elites very uncomfortable when they see that their own country has a very poor ranking, and so it helps them leverage their government. Yes, I quibble with their rankings because of the way it's done. And again, it's because they have to base it on people coming forward and giving the cases, and obviously the people who complain are the ones who are going to get paid attention to. That's okay. But I have to say, with regard to access to justice, there was a World Justice Project put out their new materials on the Access to Justice project that they have. I don't know if you're familiar with it. It came out 2 months ago. And so my staff went to it and they reported on it and they brought me the material. And the first report was on Access to Justice project in Mali. It was like, why did we spend the money? No, but again, it's not, I'm going to go with David on this. I think that there are so many ways in which the U.S. government, through our foreign assistance programs, through all the other stuff that we have out there, can just in very small ways, working with public education, working with public educators, all of that can really, really help, and it's a short-term investment for a long-term payoff. And I think, a lot of the problems that we're facing out there are generational problems. My family's from Lebanon. You grow up with a generation of hate, first against the Turks and then against whoever was in the other neighborhood. And that takes a generation or more to change those kinds of outlooks. And then you go into a civil war and it starts all over again. So I think that, one of our biggest problems is these things are generational. And we have a foreign policy that's not. And so that's why it's so important that the NGO community, like Fund for Peace and other organizations, HRW and Amnesty and all these, and Transparency International, they have to carry the ball for this long term. And we've got to figure out better ways in which to use those resources that we have out there.
I just want to throw in on the role of the private sector, because the challenges are so great that we've been talking about. All the capacity building, the education, all the things we need to change, the generational things, are so great that we need all sectors. And so absolutely the private sector has a role, and the government has a role, and NGOs have a role, and individuals have a role. We work, the Fund for Peace works a lot with oil and mining, as Flavia does as well, and several others in the room. We do this because they're often in rural areas. They're in areas where there's weak or little governance. Sometimes there's almost no government there at all. Not bad government, just no government. And they're going to have a major impact. They're going to be able to have a good, positive economic impact. We want them to also have a good, positive impact on human rights and the community's rights. And also the other great thing about an oil and a mining company is no matter how difficult a place becomes, they're going to stay there. So organizations like ours can engage them even in some of the most difficult places to work. So yeah, absolutely on the role of the private sector, but really in partnership with everyone else. Jordan.
I'm Jordan. I work with John and with Bob. I actually have a question for you, Caitlin. I actually have a question for David. I share your concern about the lack of, or not lack of, but minimal context in the human rights reporting. There is a difference between an open and a closed society. And it's a big difference. And for most of the people in the room who've been to these countries, it's the smell test or the eye test. You get off the plane and you kind of know where you are. You know, people behave differently, people talk differently. How do we get more of that in the actual reporting from the NGOs and from the State Department? You know, it's not accurately reflected in there. And is it legislatively? Is it working with NGOs? Like, how do we get those important paragraphs of when you get off the plane, this doesn't feel right, or this does feel right? And that gives a better, I think, it would give a more accurate assessment of human rights culture and human rights transparency within the countries, which I think will make a better model for this reporting in the future.
It's a really interesting question. I think that as a first step, the principals of these organizations need to speak out more vociferously about this issue because it goes underreported and unnoticed, and it has an effect. You think of a freshman on a college campus that reads a human rights report, and you know, there's you know, just take the statistics I mentioned in the beginning, and you come out thinking that you know, Tel Aviv is a worse place than Damascus, and that's crazy. And it's insane, and it ruins the very foundation of human rights. I remember Sharansky told me one time, he said, Amnesty, you gave me an award in 87, 88, you want to do as much work on my country as possible, go for it. Just have a different section for democracies and dictatorships. Make it clear. Make it incredibly clear. Bob Bernstein likes to say, I'm going to quote him now, he says, there is a huge, 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 huge difference between open and closed societies. He says 4 huges. And it really is that huge, and you're exactly right. When you step off the plane in Cairo, for me it was going to a coffee shop and sitting with a friend of mine, and I started to talk politics, and my friend silenced me immediately, and he says to me in Arabic, El hitan li hawidan, the walls have ears. Don't talk about politics in a cafe. You know, someone said to me, there's things we just shouldn't talk about, religion and politics. What the hell else would I talk about if I couldn't speak about those? Yeah, there we go. It's not allowed either. But you can start by making this case and challenging human rights groups to speak about this. There was a quote by a big person in one of the major human rights groups. It's not important which one, and it's on the record. It's in a publication. He said, "Look, we don't look at X country or Y country and decide where to do our human rights work. We find human rights abuses and we follow those, as if." You know, you hear about a human rights abuse of someone on, you know, Connecticut Street, and you need to address it as urgently as you need to address the plight of, you know, a woman in Riyadh. And it's crazy, and there's this mixing, there's this melding, this, you know, universalism of human rights, which, of course, the fundamental values are universal, but we need to do a much better job. I don't have a good answer. I don't know what the first, second, third step is. We're trying to make that a major platform of what we do. So we speak about it, we write about it, and everything we say. And indeed, our work is geared for, we could start by gearing the work of the major human rights organizations much more in the direction of closed societies, particularly the dictatorships. And the excuses that are used of credibility and even-handedness are just insufficient. When you think it through, and you think that we have to be credible to King Abdullah of Saudi Arabia, no. He needs to be credible to us. We really don't need to be credible to the government that whips women for walking outside without a man. And we can start by saying that clearly and unapologetically, and not presuming that there's some kind of unity between the worst dictatorship. But of course you're right, there are governments in the middle that need to be addressed on their own merits. You can't talk about all these dictatorships or autocracies with the same language. But the pendulum has swung so far away from that. You can see it in the language used, in the amount of time spent in certain countries. So we need to address, where the time and money goes, but also the rhetorical power that human rights groups have to make this distinction incredibly clear, so that a freshman coming out of a university today does not think in any way, shape, or form that Canada needs the UN's precious time and resources for hunger. That's crazy when 3 million people died in North Korea from hunger. Crazy, and we need to say it.
We are running out of time, I'm sorry, but I am going to give each of our panelists, wonderful panelists I might add, a moment to give some closing thoughts. So I'll first pass
Well,
to Mark.
I actually used my time to respond to Jordan's comment and this very interesting set of thoughts from David. So again, from my own experience, I was only associated with the production of 2 out of the 11 annual reports on human trafficking from the State Department. But from that experience, I will say there are some things that are special about the report, not just that it gives grades to other countries and that it probably has had more public diplomacy value than some of the other reports, but the pen for writing the report is back at the trafficking office of the State Department. And so that might be counterintuitive, especially to a couple of you who may have served as Foreign Service officers in the field, that would be better than the reporting, that the writing happened with those who were there in the field. But that's because the people who have the pen on the report take the information from the U.S. Diplomats on the ground and talk to the NGOs. And they try and bring, a balanced reality. Another last point I'd make is there is a distinction between types of government, and that's one reason why Israel responded when it got low rankings in the human trafficking report to talk with the United States. Here, the United States, its ally, was criticizing it publicly. It wanted to take steps to have protections for those who were human trafficking victims. That's a sign of it being a different kind of government. I will say, however, that we need to raise such issues with both types of government, whether they be democratic or not. And so I'd actually defend a policy of raising it with everybody. There just has to be some balance. When you see there's 10 times as much discussed in the UN Human Rights Council about Israel than any other country, you might want to ask, is that the right proportion?
I think our position often gets confused with the idea that we don't think that human rights abuses should be spoken about or addressed in open societies, and nothing could be further from the truth. The point is that when there are countries that have the mechanisms to correct and do speak about it openly in the press, that's the important point we're saying. I'll just use my last minute to sum up the way that I think human rights should be approached today, particularly in terms of pressuring governments. I was in Turkey and I ran across someone who was on the first trade mission to Libya, trade delegation from the United States to Libya. And I asked him, I said, what do you think about Fatih al-Jahmi, who was the most famous Libyan dissident who had died shortly before that? And he looked at me and he said, who's that? And I couldn't believe that the first person who was going on a trade delegation to Libya didn't know who the most famous dissident of the country is. And I thought back to something that was told to me by the person who was in charge of all bilateral arms negotiations with the Soviet Union in the 1980s. And he said in every single meeting with his Soviet counterparts, he said, we cannot trust you because you violate the Helsinki Final Act in your treatment of Sakharov, Sharansky, and Orlov. And that, I think, is the model that we have a role to play in pressuring policymakers to bring up those names of dissidents in every meeting, because ultimately we need to fear tyranny more than anarchy, and we need to prize liberty above stability. I'm firmly of the opinion that the only long-term guarantor of peace, prosperity, and stability is granting or upholding the natural rights of man. And so if we have any power in this room, it's to pressure those who really can make a difference in these meetings with King Abdullah, in these meetings with the other leaders in the Middle East, to raise the issue of democratic dissidence and to not relegate that to the 9th or 10th point of discussion, if it's raised at all, with the reality in mind of the realpolitik concerns of oil and intelligence cooperation. But we need to get back to that ideal where every meeting is started, or at least it's very high on the agenda, what these individuals are going through, who symbolize far broader trends in the region. And thanks again for having me.
I want to thank Krista and the Fund for Peace for the patience they exhibited in trying to reconcile our 3 schedules to get us here. I'm really glad we were able to do this, and I look forward to continuing discussions with my colleagues here. My first job out of university was in Puerto Rico, and it was a Peace Corps training center. They were training people for 7 different Latin countries, and I had my freshly minted master's degree from Pitt in intercultural communications, and they said, well, do you speak Spanish? And I said, no. They said, have you ever been to a Latin American country? I said, no. And I said, what are you doing here? Well, I said, you're the experts on the culture, and I'm the expert on how to ask questions. And I think that is really what the role that human rights organizations can do better, is to learn how to ask questions that minimize the extrapolation from a few cases to general claims of violations, that understand local context, that take into consideration how that context can fit into a larger process moving these countries toward greater political reform, and sees the linkages between political and civil liberties and rights and economic, cultural, and social rights. And that, I think, begins with knowing how to frame the questions and enabling the people on the ground to ask those same questions and to be persistent with those questions to get the answers, to put the leadership in civil society, leadership in the private sector, leadership in the governments and all the organizations on notice that these questions are continuing to be asked until conditions change and people can aspire to a better future, but also attain that future. It's generational, but as a parent, that's what I do for my kids.
I'm
Lebanese, I'm allowed to do this.
To close on. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, speakers. Thank you, audience.
Thanks for coming.
Thanks.